So next, we're going to have a sort of a reflexive conversation about the composition and makeup of the economics discipline. So we have Anna Stansbury, me, and Zach Bleemer talking about the composition of economics. So, and we'll lead with Anna. So go ahead.
Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. Is this the clicker? Yes. So I'll load up my slides in just a second, but I'm going to be talking about the composition of the economics discipline in the US, and particularly focusing on who does the PhD in economics. And I'm going to be talking about three aspects of this: socioeconomic status, race, and gender. So the first thing to note is, I'm sorry, I can't seem to change the slides.
Is that the remote?
The green arrow?
There you go.
Oh, it just took a while to figure out. Great, thank you. Okay, so we all know that economics has a gender problem. It's been discussed extensively over recent years, but it's worth emphasizing because it hasn't changed very much in a long time. So you can see on the left, or the left-hand side of the slide, the composition of US PhDs in economics and in different subjects in 2010 to 2018. About a third of PhDs were women in economics. This is a bit more than in some of the other quantitative subjects like math and computer science, but is decidedly less than half and decidedly less than in a lot of other fields. Something I think that is particularly salient when we think about gender is that nothing has changed in about 30 years. So you can see in the graph on the right that the share of US economics PhDs who were women in 1995 was also about a third. Similarly, for bachelor's degrees, the share has stayed at about a third for the last 30 years. You can see that this is in contrast to STEM, which is the dashed line on the right, where actually the share of STEM PhDs and undergrads who are women has gone up pretty fast over time. Where should I be pointing this to make this work? Okay, race and ethnicity. Economics race and ethnicity problem has also got increasing attention over the last few years. It's a starker problem than the gender problem. So you can see that same graph on the left, but this now shows the share of US PhD recipients who are an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority. Here we use the NSF definition of underrepresented racial or ethnic minority. That's based on which racial and ethnic groups are underrepresented in US academia and in US colleges. So that is Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and Native American or Pacific Islander. It doesn't include Asian American because Asian Americans are not underrepresented relative to their share of the population in colleges or in academia. This focuses only on US-born PhD recipients, following a lot of the literature on race and ethnicity in science, because in different countries, in different contexts, different ethnicities and races are underrepresented or overrepresented. But even if you look across all PhD recipients, including those who are born outside the US, which for economics is a large share, you still see that economics stands out as having a very disproportionately low share, particularly of Black PhDs as compared to other fields. Again, we can now look on the right to see how this has changed over time. And once again, you see that since the mid-1990s, there's been very little progress amongst economics PhDs in the share that are an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority. In the bachelor's field, it's improved a little bit over recent years, but still more slowly than STEM and then a lot of other subjects. The third aspect, which is something that I've been doing work on in recent years, largely motivated by noticing that we weren't talking about it, is that economics also has a socioeconomic diversity problem. And this is the worst of any PhD field in the US. So this is newly documented by myself and Robert Schultz, who was a master's student at Michigan when we did this project. And this shows the share of PhD recipients who are first-generation college graduates in each PhD field again. We've separated it on the left in terms of all PhD recipients, and then on the right only in terms of the US born, because again, whether or not someone's parent has a college degree or a graduate degree is just a different signal of socioeconomic status in different countries. And so looking just at the US born, we can compare like for like in a better way. What you can see here, economics is solidly at the bottom of the pack and is even more obviously at the bottom of the pack if you just look at the US born. One thing I want to emphasize here is this is cutting it into 15 very broad PhD categories. You know, you've got the whole of the physical sciences, the whole of the biological sciences in one category. If you cut it into narrow fields, so the NSF defines about 200 narrow PhD fields, economics still makes it to the top of the list as the least socioeconomically diverse field amongst the US-born PhD recipients. It narrowly pips to the post, number 2 and number 3, which are art, history, and classics. So if we're thinking about what are your stereotypically elite fields, economics is doing even worse than those. Unfortunately, this is just getting worse over time. So you would expect the share of first-gen college grads in a field to fall over time, right? Because the population is becoming more educated. So you can see in this graph here, the dashed line is our imputed estimate of the share of the population in the US who are of a similar age to PhD recipients. So we're picking 27 to 37-year-olds roughly, who have no parent with a college degree, who are first-generation college grads. And you can see that's going down because more people go to college. Then all the colored lines are 8 different PhD fields and their share of US PhD recipients that were US-born PhD recipients that were first-generation college grads. 2 things I want to pull out here. The first is that economics, math, and computer science diverged from most other fields in about the 1970s. They start to get less representative relative to the rest of academia. But then in about the mid-90s, economics diverges again from math and computer science and continues to get worse while math and computer science level off. And if you look at gender and race, you see the same timing. Economics starts to stagnate in terms of its increases in diversity for race, gender, and socioeconomic background at about the same time in the mid-90s, early 2000s. It's interesting to look at each of these 3 separately. But it's also important to look at them intersectionally. And it's important because I think it changes our focus in terms of who and which groups we think are the least represented in our field. We talk a lot about gender, and I think it's important that we do so, particularly because for gender, we see a very leaky pipeline post-PhD, and this does not improve over time. And it seems to be very strongly linked to family formation, to networks, to mentorship. But it is also important to emphasize that high SES women are very overrepresented in economics relative to the population average. And this is even more true if you look specifically at white high SES women. And I say this as someone who feels as a white high SES woman that I should not be the primary target of diversity efforts in economics when there are so many other groups that are far less well represented. So what you see here to illustrate that is you have for men and for women, the share of the similar aged population to PhDs who are men and have a parent with a graduate degree, have a parent with a BA, or have no parent with a BA, and then the share amongst US-born economics PhDs who are in those groups. So if the US-born economics PhD bar is bigger than the population bar, that means that group is overrepresented and vice versa. So you can see that amongst women, the red bar, about 17% of US-born economics PhDs are women with a parent with a graduate degree, relative to only about 7% of the similar aged population. So that's showing high SES women are overrepresented. Similarly for men, you can see that low SES men are underrepresented. Of course, low SES women are even more underrepresented because they're both underrepresented on gender and on SES kind of dimensions. This is also important to consider in the case of race. So thinking about intersectionality, as we would expect, as is borne out in the data, Black and Hispanic first-generation college grads are particularly starkly underrepresented in economics. For example, about 9% of the similar-aged US population are Black first-generation college grads. That is about 0.4% of economics PhDs. For Hispanics, the ratio of underrepresentation is a bit similar, a bit better. About 10% of the population are Hispanic first-generation college grads. About 1% of economics PhDs are. But it's also important to emphasize that even among races that are overrepresented, first-generation college grads are still underrepresented. So whether for Asian or for white non-Hispanic individuals, the degree is just less stark than for Black and Hispanic. The other thing I would mention on intersectionality that is important to note is that Black PhD recipients are the only group where even high SES folks are not overrepresented. You can see that by comparing the 2 red bars, which are very small but are about the same size. So this is suggesting that whatever is happening with race in economics is so stark that it is outweighing any sort of positive impact that high SES is having in terms of access to economics. The next thing I want to show, I'm sorry to bombard you with all these very depressing facts, but I think we need to know them. The next thing that I want to show you is that the SES gradient is particularly stark in the top ranked institutions. So this is taking the ranks from US News and World Report as one rough metric of not only the kind of opportunities that someone gets in their PhD, but also the opportunities they get after their PhD, because half of tenure track US economics professors get their PhDs at one of these 15 institutions. So you can see here that among the very top ranked schools, about 5% of the US-born students are first-generation college grads. About 80% are someone with a parent with a graduate degree. That's a PhD, an MD, a JD, an MBA, highly, highly socioeconomically advantaged. It looks a bit better amongst the foreign-born, but not that much. Okay, so we've had a whole lot of facts about what is happening. I want to spend the last portion of my remarks today talking about some aspects that might help us shed some light on why this is. And I'm sure we all have hypotheses that I'm interested to hear. There's a few facts that will help guide our search for hypotheses and therefore for solutions. One is that these three axes of diversity are super strongly correlated across fields. Economics is in the bottom left corner for everything because economics is pretty bad on all these metrics, but you see that there are these strong correlations between the share that's female, the share that's Black or Hispanic or Native American, and the share that is first generation college grad. These shares are not mechanically correlated. There is a correlation between race and SES, but that is not explaining this pattern. So it suggests that to a first order approximation, it's the same kinds of factors that may be limiting access for students from different underrepresented groups across fields. The next fact to emphasize is that the correlation is less strong, but the highly international PhD fields are also worse on SES grounds amongst US-born and actually amongst foreign-born students, suggesting that there might be something to do with the fact that the more internationally competitive fields are edging out students who have had less advantage or less opportunity from any individual country. The third fact is that econ at the undergrad level is already less socioeconomically diverse than a lot of other similar majors like math and social sciences. And I believe Zach will be able to shed some light on this for us later. So this problem is starting partly at the undergrad level already. The third, and this was the most striking thing I think that came out of our data explorations, at least for me, was that undergrad institution type is super relevant. So this is the share of US-born PhDs in different fields who have their undergrad from a public school or from an Ivy Plus school, which we just follow Chetty et al. As defining as the 8 Ivy League schools plus 4 more, which is Stanford, MIT, Chicago, and Duke. Those schools we picked because they are the most socioeconomically advantaged schools. About 15% of people at those schools come from the top 1% of the income distribution, 80% come from the top 40%. And economics is just far, far an outlier in terms of how many of its PhD students come from those 12 schools. If you actually look at the top 6 programs for PhDs, this is even more stark. Nearly half of their US-born PhD recipients got their degree from an Ivy League or Ivy Plus school, compared to about a quarter that went to any public US institution. But, and we have regressions showing this in the paper, undergrad major and undergrad school only explain about half of the gap between economics and other fields. The rest of the SES gap is explained by something else. And I can walk through those coefficients with my nice arrows. Final thing that I want to then give some speculation on is, informed by these facts, what might be going on. There are 3 portions of the pipeline that we need to think about. One is at the undergrad level, one is from undergrad to PhD, and then one is what's happening after the PhD level, which I haven't talked about today, but which I have a new project looking at what happens post-PhD. And we find that in economics, but also in other fields, there's still an SES gradient in terms of where low SES individuals end up, where they stay in academia and whether they leave academia. So there's more going on later in the pipeline. At the undergrad level, part of what's going on is common to quantitative fields. We saw that math and computer science are also less socioeconomically diverse, racially diverse, and gender diverse than other fields, but part of it is specific to econ. I think we need to think about 3 channels here. One is information and awareness. Do econ majors actually know? Do prospective majors actually know what econ is? Is it the breadth of topics that we study? One is that there appears to be evidence of differential persistence by different groups in post-intro courses. And one that I would think is very relevant to what we've talked about today is whether people may be differentially turned off by either the presentation or the substance of the material that we actually teach in Intro Econ. And here I would think both about what the common presumption is in terms of how markets work and how well they work, but also in terms of the language that we use. For example, terms like unskilled or low ability to describe whole swathes of the population, I think are probably not only inaccurate, but also offensive and disproportionately so to some groups. From the undergrad to PhD portion of the pipeline, I think we can think about a number of factors. And note here that this is not relevant for gender. There's no fall off here, but it is relevant for race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Part of it might be better outside options in other professions. Econ leads to very highly paid careers after the undergrad degree. But I think part of it, at least, must be some function of lack of access to mentorship, resources, and networks that require you to navigate the process, particularly as the pipeline from undergrad to PhD is so complicated in economics. You need lots of math courses, you need RA-ships. It's not obvious that you just do your econ major and you can get into a PhD from that. And then in terms of research careers post-PhD, we should be thinking about mentorship, opportunities, research quality, and prejudice and bias, as well as, of course, for women, the effect of family formation and care responsibilities, and the intersectional effect this might have for women from low SES backgrounds. So I know that I'm a little over time, so I'm going to leave it there, but I would love to hear others' thoughts either during this session or later as to what we can do. I want to emphasize that I think this matters for 3 reasons. This matters in any profession because of inefficiency and because of inequity, right? And I don't need to convince this room that that might matter. But I think it matters particularly in a social science like economics because we are studying social phenomena, and therefore the lived experiences that we have are going to affect our contextual knowledge of the phenomena that we study. They're going to affect the hypotheses that we generate. They're going to affect the kinds of conclusions that we reach. And so I think that the actual quality and substance of our research is really likely to suffer as a result of this. So we should care a lot. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to stand over here so I can see this. Should I just keep going? Nope. No worries. All right, so apologies to George Stigler. So I'm going to sort of talk about, I first started working on this in 2011, and it was just clearly no one wanted to hear it, that you were, supposing that economists actually had partisan beliefs that were actually tied up with their economics, with their views about the economy, and it was like airing the dirty laundry. That sort of no one wanted to talk about. So finally, the paper is forthcoming, and it took like 12 years. So partly the view from outside of economics is that economists are, if you're on the right, you think economists are a bunch of liberals that are trying to come up with interventionist policies all the time. If you're a liberal, you think economists are a bunch of reactionary free marketeers. And broadly, if you're on either side, you think of economists as like neoliberal. Economists sort of resent this categorization of them as political. And so I love this article. It's Stigler, 1959, where he's like the politics of political economists. And he basically makes the point that, some theorists might be particularly radical in their views, but anybody who's working on sort of concrete applied policy issues can't be too radical because we're kind of disciplined by the empirical magnitudes of the relationships that we see. And so it just, we're like become intrinsically small c conservative. And that's kind of the argument of the paper. And just in sort of building on what Anna was presenting, there's reasons to think, even if you didn't know anything about what economists studied, just by virtue of who they are and where they sit in the social distribution, you might think that they might have some distinctive politics. They're rich. They're paid more than any other social science. For example, they're, as we saw, they're like whiter and more male. And all of this is going to push towards them having more conservative views on average than the general population. On the other hand, they're also extremely highly educated, and that's going to push them into having very left-wing views, particularly on social issues. And so we can imagine that, you know, the actual partisan identity of economists might reflect, like it does in the rest of the population, some mix of their views on economic and non-economic issues. And so, you know, part of the effort is to try to pick up these divisions inside sort of quote unquote mainstream economics, and just like ask the question if we can sort of find these divisions within mainstream economics, and then we can sort of ask the question, is this okay? And, you know, probably, and maybe it's good even. And this is particularly all within US economists, and I think going to other countries it would be trickier and also interesting. So we're not the first to sort of look at this. So, you know, an inspiration for this is this paper by Fuchs, Kruger, and Perturba, who did this survey of economists in the 1990s, asking them both their views about various policy issues, their views on particular parameter estimates, and whether or not there was any alignment between what they thought, how they thought the world looked, and what they thought should be done about things. And it turned out their beliefs about parameter estimates had a very weak effect on their views about policy issues. It was overwhelmingly like their kind of broader normative views on all kinds of things that had a bigger predictive effect on their policy views than anything about their views on particular point estimates of particular parameters. And so, you know, but of course the conclusion is always we need more research. But you know, so Gordon and Dahl tried to do this among the economists that are surveyed by the Institute for Global Markets at Booth, and they try to apply a clustering algorithm to sort of see if you can partition economists into liberal and conservative based on how they answer various questions on the IGM panel, and they kind of get that they find that you can't actually effectively cluster the economists on the basis of their responses to these questions. In this paper I have with Zubin Jove and Bruce Kogut, we kind of find, we use the text of academic articles where we link economists to their campaign contributions and the kinds of petitions they sign to basically like try to form an NLP classifier of their partisan behavior using just the language of their academic articles. It turns out there's plenty of predictive power in how economists write for their partisan behavior. And so it's like, you know, you tell me the kinds of academic articles you write, I can probably figure out, you know, whether or not you're likely to give to the Democrats or the Republicans. And so this is just kind of like what the sort of, it's interesting, right? Economists are somewhat contradictory in the sense that when you look at their campaign contributions, they're overwhelmingly Democrat. It's like 80% of economists, if they contribute to the Democrats. And then there's 20, you know, something like 20% that contribute to the Republicans. And what's interesting though is that this is way higher than any other social science. Like basically you can go whole sociology departments and not find a single Republican. And so it's really like economists have the most Republicans of like kind of any of the social sciences, but it's still an extremely small share. So that's probably consistent with what anyone's sort of casual empiricism is. But the other side of it, though, is that when you look at the kinds of petitions economists are willing to sign on behalf of what issues, you'll then find that they're actually much more willing to sign sort of economically conservative petitions. So things like supporting free trade, supporting budget balance, sort of Republican positions on economic issues. You'll sort of find economists, despite favoring Democrats in electoral politics, when it comes to the economic issues, they are sort of like, you know, somewhat more conservative on this. So they're signing much more the Republican sort of side of petitions than the Democratic side of petitions. Okay, so this is like the totally unsurprising graph of like what predicts your relative conservatism in economics by like field and demographic characteristics. So unsurprisingly, the most conservative field in economics is finance, and then macro, and then law and economics as the next one. The most left-wing field is, unsurprisingly, labor economics, and then sort of like public and development kind of up there. Of course, business school professors tend to be more conservative. The saltwater schools are more left-wing, the freshwater schools are more right-wing, And you know, and the men are more right wing. So, so that's kind of, I think, you know, sort of again consistent with the casual empiricism. The other sort of thing we can do, you can't read all the journals here, but what we did is sort of, because we can recover the ideological valence of each phrase, we can produce like an article level measure of like how much does it sound like a Republican or a Democrat. And then you can kind of run an AKM decomposition on that and sort of isolate author fixed effects and journal fixed effects and year fixed effects. And so these are the journal fixed effects. And so again, unsurprisingly, the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics is the most left-wing journal, and Public Choice is the most right-wing journal. But interestingly, the top 5 journals in the X's there are all kind of, you know, are on average more conservative than you know all the journals in our sample, with of course the JPE being the most conservative of the top 5 journals. So not surprising, but you know things you might have already known. But it's not because of their authors, because this is all conditioning on the author fixed effects at least. And so it's like people are tailoring articles to the journal. Okay. So what does that mean? It's that you know, I think it's that econs are, like most academics, they're Democrats, but they're a very particular type of Democrat. And so they're, you know, they're roughly center right. They tend to be in favor of the welfare state. They like taxes and transfers. You know, they're generally in favor of redistribution. But you know, they're often much more opposed to minimum wages, to unions, to protectionism, to kind of job programs. And what I sort of think is interesting is that, and this is some recent work with Ilyana Kuzyenko and Nicholas Marx, is that this is very consistent with the views, the differences in views on policy issues by the relatively educated. So when we've been sort of assembling polling data going back 80 years on the views on particular economic policy issues. And when you look at the views of the relatively educated are the people that, you know, conditional on support for some level of redistribution, they're much more in favor of kind of like tax and transfer mechanisms for delivering a level of equality. And the relatively educated are also much more opposed to these kind of more pre-distribution methods, like directly intervening in the economy to redistribute income. So, and so it's just kind of interesting that that sort of the policy preferences of economists line up so well with the policy preferences of the relatively educated. And it's just kind of like the economist is kind of the organic intellectuals of the relatively educated, sort of articulating their policy views. And so just to, you know, what I'll conclude with is the evidence we have on that. So this is like a regression. These are regression coefficients, you know, separately. This is the coefficient on years of schooling, indicating your support for these various policies. So the top 3, the top 3 are things like tax the rich, tax me more, and then we have the top 2 are tax the rich or tax me more. And you see that the relatively educated, you know, have consistently, this is going back to the 1940s, have consistently supported, you know, they like taxes, they like taxing me more, compared to the less educated. But but among all of these other policies, things like provide jobs for all, create new jobs, confidence in organized labor, union support, pro-protectionism, unions should have more influence, you should help struggling people find jobs, you should raise the minimum wage. On all of those things, the relatively less educated are much more in favor of it than the relatively educated. And so it's almost like if you wanted to, you know, what the argument we make in this paper, if you wanted to sort of explain partisan realignment by education, you could do worse than look at the pivot kind of in the late 70s of the Democratic Party away from these kind of traditional New Deal pre-distribution policies towards the kinds of policies favored by economists. And that could be one of, you know, we sort of find in the paper that explains about 50% of educational realignment. So, you know, the sort of conclude with this point that the policy mix that sort of traditional economics suggests, it's not kind of one that's universally appreciated in the public, and there's in fact kind of very much lines up with the natural educational class gradient in the U.S. population. I'll turn it over to Zach.
that. I need the clicker as well. Thanks so much, Suresh. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to be on this panel. And now I think I have to just say a couple of words randomly until my slides appear. I'm going to take this in a somewhat different direction than the previous two talks. This is a panel about the composition of economists and the ways in which policies that change the composition of economists, ideally policies that we have some impact over, could themselves promote inclusive prosperity in the United States. And so what I want to do just for these 10 minutes is to try to convince you that you all are not economists in a first order sense. We are economics professors, and economists are the things that we produce. So I hope that would be enough time, but great. So let me tell you, instead of telling you about yourselves, tell you about our products, the economists.
Point at the box,
Okay, great. I've got it, thanks. Okay, so there are 1.9 million economists in the US. These are people who have undergraduate degrees in economics. Of those 1.9 million people, 12,000 of them report themselves as being post-secondary teachers of economics. That's us, though only a much smaller share of them work at research universities, probably a far smaller share. So you should think of this as, of all Americans, about 0.6% of them are economists. That's 2.2% of college graduates. It's something like 1% of those are economics professors, and about 4% of them have a PhD in some field, though these are just people with economics undergraduate degrees and a PhD somewhere. Economists in the US have average wages at age 40 of $125,000 a year. That's about 50% higher than the average wage of a college graduate in the US. And both women and underrepresented minorities, Black and Hispanic workers in the US, are underrepresented in the economics field relative to other college graduates. I think that aligns very closely with what Anna was just talking about. So given this sort of frame, we're thinking about economists in the US. I'd like to convince you of two things that will help point us toward a potential policy to use the composition of economists to promote inclusive prosperity. The first thing I want to convince you of is the fact that economists earn about 50% more than the average college grad in the US is not because of observational differences between who goes into the economics major. It's also not because of non-observational differences. It's because we have an incredible power such that we produce college graduates who earn very high wages in the economy. It's a causal effect of us. So this is a graph from work that I conducted with Ashish Mehta at UC Santa Barbara that came out last year. What we're doing is sort of studying an interesting policy implemented at UC Santa Cruz over the last 15 years since the financial crisis. UC Santa Cruz prohibits students who have below a 2.8 GPA in their first two econ classes that they take when they arrive on campus from earning the economics major. So here we have a running variable. This is your GPA in two classes. And you can see that there are some students in the left-hand panel who are able to get into the economics major even if they don't have above a 2.8 GPA. But there's a big jump for students who get exactly a 2.8 are much more likely to be allowed to study economics at UC Santa Cruz. And then if you move from the left panel to the middle panel, we're just following all of those kids into the labor market in California. And you can see that right across the threshold, there's something like an $8,000 reduced form gain in wages in kids' late 20s relative to the wages earned just below this threshold if they were allowed into Santa Cruz's economics major. Right? Remember that we moved about a third of kids into the economics major, so the IV suggests that the return to studying economics at UC Santa Cruz is on the order of $22,000 a year in the early career, which is about a 45 or 50% wage increase for these kids, almost exactly the observational wage gain that you would have expected just given the average wage of economists. You can see in the right-hand panel, all I'm doing is indexing kids' wages by the major that they earn in college. And you can see that the middle and right-hand panel almost exactly mirror each other. These kids are flowing into majors that are higher paying, and they themselves earn higher wages 10 years later in the labor market. A second way of framing that information is asking what majors would kids earn if they didn't become economists and had to study something else instead. So you can see those majors along the bottom here. At Santa Cruz, about 20% of them would have studied psychology, environmental studies, and then this degree that's sort of like a business degree and sociology come up next. But these poor souls end up with far lower earnings than we were able to give them. If you look at these bars, what I'm doing here is first focus all the way on the left. I'm just showing you the width of the bar is the share of kids who counterfactually went into these other majors, and the height of the bar are the average wages of kids who go into those majors. And so what you can see is the average wage of the black bars, and then the average wage of the blue bars, the economics major that these kids are able to get to instead. The difference between the two is $19,000 a year, almost exactly the same as that $22,000 you can see all the way on the right. That is the causal effect of earning an economics major. This is a bunch of ways of saying the observational return to studying economics relative to the qualitative social sciences these students would otherwise earn seems to exactly indicate the causal return to studying in this field. So here's the first thing I want you to take away. You have unbelievable capabilities to promote the wages of your students. Here's the second thing I want you to take away. UC Santa Cruz's policy of prohibiting low GPA students from earning this economics major is a very common kind of policy, especially in lucrative majors like economics. So what I'm doing here is showing you, sorry for the small font, the top 26 public universities in the United States, just as ranked by US News. Keep in mind, just these universities alone, 26 universities, enroll about 9% of all undergraduates in the US. These are big, important schools in the US. And then I'm showing you the 5 most lucrative majors on average at those universities, and then filling in the table with what you have to do in order to earn that major at that university. There's a bunch of numbers. The number indicates the GPA that you have to earn in that major's introductory courses as of 2002, this is 20 years ago, in order to earn that given major. There's a couple of A's. A means that there's a competitive application. You submit letters, you submit essays, and they choose who is allowed to earn that degree at that university. There's a couple of HS's. These are majors that you have to directly apply to from high school, otherwise you're prohibited from switching into this major. So this is what these restrictions look like. You can see about half of all of these lucrative fields have some kind of restriction in place in 2002. It's about 5, I think, of the 26 economics degrees had a restriction in 2002. I'll click forward to show you what this looks like today, or at least when we did it in 2019. I'm underlining new restrictions. I'm bolding restrictions where the GPA cap rose. You can see these majors are becoming much more restricted. It's now 11 of these 26 majors in economics have some kind of restriction in place. And across the board, these GPA caps are rising, though keep in mind part of this is a joint decision to increase grades overall through grade inflation and to increase the cap that students have to achieve in order to be allowed into the field. These restrictions are extremely common, not just in these lucrative majors at these very selective universities, but across the country at public universities. They're almost unheard of at private schools. The top 25 private school economics departments have no restrictions. But what I'm doing here is showing you for all majors at R1 research public universities in the US, weighted by the number of students in those majors. In the dark red, you can see the majors that have a GPA restriction on who's allowed into the major. In lighter red, you can see those discretionary majors, applications into the major. The yellow color shows majors that require you to have a certain overall GPA at the university, above a 2.3 in order to get into the major. These are somewhat less restrictive. And then the green majors have no restrictions at all. You can see that at public R1 universities, which enroll about 1/3 of all undergraduates in the US, about 1/3 of majors, student weighted, have some kind of GPA restriction in place, but about half of economics majors have some kind of GPA restriction in place. What are the ramifications of these restrictions? Let me just show you observationally. Here we're just running a regression of the share Black and Hispanic students in a major on whether your major has some kind of major restriction in place. This is non-causal. We're just looking at the differences in composition across different kinds of majors. If you focus all the way on the right-hand side, you can see majors that have a mechanical GPA restriction have about 2 percentage points fewer Black and Hispanic students. That's 10% fewer Black and Hispanic students from the baseline mean. There's no real difference, statistically noisy differences for these discretionary restrictions, which you might have in mind are sort of like holistic review in admissions. You can sort of have implicit affirmative action policies when you're looking at essays, but not when you're looking at GPA caps. And there's no effect of these overall GPA restrictions. Kids can just take easy classes to get out of the restriction. But you can see that it looks like these restrictions have a disproportionate effect, at least observationally, of excluding the economics major from relatively disadvantaged students. So Ashish and I have a recent working paper that just looks causally at, or in an event study design at what happens to majors when they impose major restriction policies. All I want you to take away from these figures, because I'm going to move through them quite quickly, is that after a major restriction is imposed, we see an immediate 20% decline in URM, Black and Hispanic enrollment in restricted majors, and an immediate increase in the average family income of the students who are permitted into these majors at 4 universities in the University of California system, where we have high quality data to track what happens after major restrictions are put into place. So what do I want you to take away from all of this? If you combine these two pieces of information, what I hope you've learned is that you as economics professors, as a producer of economists, have this pretty impressive, tractable and scalable economic mobility pipeline that you can generate for low-income students. By educating low-income students, you promote their own economic mobility. But at the same time, public universities seem to be going out of their way to restrict access to us away from disadvantaged and lower income students. And so what I would suggest is that we have a direct policy mechanism by which we can promote inclusive prosperity. This is by going out of our way to educate more, especially low-income and disadvantaged students who desire these majors, who are currently being turned away from them primarily at public universities. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
I guess we'll take questions.
This is not a question, but it's a notice that Anna in particular might be interested in, but I think many others might be as well. And that is that on the Social Science Research Council website, ssrc.org, there is, on your phone, it'll come up first, a call for proposal jointly by the Committee for the Status of Women in the Economics Profession of the AEA and the SSRC to form a Women in Economics Research Consortium. And I urge all interested parties to go to that website, check it out, and see if you have a proposal to make.
Thank you.
I guess we'll take all the questions and then respond.
Zach, I actually have a question for you on the regression you showed by the, say, political leanings by field. What is the causality? And there's something you might think about. I also have further to about your lack of Republicans. I have an incident, 2 incidents to relate. I studied economics at MIT in the early 60s. And the building that MIT Economics Department is in has the faculty club on the top floor. And the economics faculty usually would dine together for lunch, then all get into the elevator and come down to the 3rd floor. But one time the elevator stopped on the 4th floor, the door opened and closed. And I think Evsy Domar commented, oh, the Republican in the department just got in. Further, as you know, Samuelson was the leader of that department, and he wasn't at Harvard because of both anti-math and anti-Semitism. At the time was not giving him a tenured track position. I've heard in our corridors Keynes referred to as an outstanding Gentile economist.
I used to be a male business school professor in finance, so I can attest to some of the coefficient estimates that Suresh you had. But my question, I was thinking that it seemed like there is a sort of a complementarity between Anna's and yours presentation, because if I look at those coefficients, like again, macro, finance, labor on the other side, I'm guessing as out of sample prediction that on Anna, it might be like there's an anecdotal correlation between them. And so that potentially suggests that the political partisanship of a particular field or subfield is actually a barrier, because I can very well imagine that low SES individuals, they don't match with those kind of partisanship attitudes that Suresh talked about. So I don't know if you've already looked at that.
Firstly, thank you. I think the panel is right on spot on many things. I've been teaching 26 years. I get students who are broken-hearted pre-meds and they cannot make it in pre-med, so they become economists. Some of them don't know what economics is. They think it's finance and they become econ majors. Some of the problems that we have is we are not doing a good job in explaining what economics is. So I don't think the problem is necessarily with economics. It's with, with the production function, with the professors and with us. I was teaching a class 6 years ago with an English professor together. That's probably the first time in the world that econ and English collaborates. She thinks that we are the source of every evil in the world. After 6 years teaching together, I think, maybe we are closer together, but I also understand that this is not only the students, our other colleagues also have the same perception about us. So I think we need to be less boring. I think one problem is that we are boring, and not in an engineering way. We have a very specific way to be boring. I think we have to also look at, what are we doing in the classroom with our research, how we present our research. So less boring, more accessible, and also more relevant. Also, are we teaching inequality in our introduction classes? We say that we don't have time, we have to cram everything. Well, that's a priority. If you don't teach that, I teach at Boston College. I have a lot of privileged students. I think that my job is to make them uncomfortable, to show them that inequality cuts both ways. It's not only detrimental for the students who are at the bottom of the distribution, but also it hurts the ones on the top of the distribution. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mata. I'm going to start with a comment and then I have a question also. So first, my comment is that I'm a pre-doc and we're watching you. So during the Me Too of, November of last year, we were paying attention to who was saying what. And in particular, I personally was astounded by the overwhelming silence of male economists when it came to the accusations that were levied, or the disbelief that male economists were propagating. So, I didn't go like those comments on Twitter because I wanted to stay anonymous in this sense, but we are watching. As pre-docs, we were discussing, and when making decisions on where to go to our PhD programs, we are paying attention. So even though you might not see us, we're looking. So that's my comment. And please speak up. When you see something, it can be a really small thing. So for example, even in undergrad, one time I used Mrs. rather than professor to describe a female professor, and the male economist immediately corrected me, didn't you mean professor? And that, it stuck with me for, 8 years now. And those really small moments can have a big impact. So I encourage you all to take those opportunities whenever you can. And the next is more of a very small sort of issue. With respect to the caps on the GPA, one question I have is, especially at public institutions like Berkeley, how would you then address the class limitations? Because right now, I remember I couldn't even get into the macro that was required. I emailed Professor Martha only, trying to get credits, like, oh, we have the same name, can't you get me into the class? So how would you then address that kind of issue where it's also like a supply of teaching force? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I wanted to offer some hypotheses, suggestions, in part based on my experience having graduated from a bachelor's in economics in 2017. So first wanted to echo this prior comment about the importance of communicating what economics is and what it isn't. So from my personal experience, I came into economics from mostly a math program and discovered what the tools of economics could possibly study, which I didn't know and probably wouldn't have gone into the discipline otherwise. I think the GPA major requirements are just one kind of example of the pattern of the need to prepare early for the next step along the pipeline. But it's not just things that are so clear cut and dry, such as that policy, but things like needing to know how to navigate the academic system, whether that means cold emailing professors to ask them if you could be a research assistant, and the importance of getting on track early on, say early in undergraduate experience and even like further down the pipeline to make sure that you're on the right track to get into graduate school to take the next step, and making those sort of hidden curriculum things pretty important. And I think my last comment was going to be about how some of this early preparation type of things then limits who ends up in the field, and then both affects perceptions and peers. So, right, whether a person wants to become a part of a field is in part based on who their classmates are going to be. And I think there's something else to be said that. Oh, one last comment, rather, is something that didn't come up in this discussion, but I've seen work on elsewhere, is resources like textbooks, examples, how those things can affect people. I had one experience where in my undergrad, one of my textbooks mentioned a like Guatemalan landscaper, and I'm half Guatemalan, so that affected me but didn't deter me from the field. But examples like that I think are important to mention. So any of your comments on those things are welcome. Thank you.
Hi. So I have a question.
We'll take these last two questions and then we'll respond.
Sure. Yeah. And this is really a question to which I don't know the answer. At least I don't think I do. One of the things I was thinking about when y'all were, especially Suresh, but really all of you were talking about the impact of both background and political beliefs on what economists study and how we think about the world, is that I just wonder how, I can sort of think about that in different ways, one slightly cynical and one slightly less so. So one of them is, we're all biased. We all have our biases. We all have our beliefs. Lord knows I have my beliefs, and they influence the things we study and what we teach. And I think that's pretty straightforward and obviously true at some level. However, I also think you could kind of frame it the other way, which is that if we are at some level trying to seek truth, when we discover the truth, it changes our beliefs. And I think it's probably right too that true empiricism probably has a centrist bias, because we all have political narratives we want to tell ourselves, and we pay attention to the things that confirm our beliefs and pay less attention to things that don't. And so I think it's probably true that, I'll say I've probably become more, I wouldn't even say centrist, just like more accepting of ambiguity and evidence about what is right and what is wrong, or like less willing to think I know the answers to certain difficult political questions. Maybe that's because I've gotten older, but it also, the optimistic view is I teach a lot of empirical papers and I read a lot of empirical papers, and the evidence doesn't always go the same way when the study is done well. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on how to disentangle those things, because it seems like, the first thing is like really obviously a problem that we should fix, but the second thing is actually something we don't want to fix. We actually want to have a discipline that encourages truth seeking and updating our beliefs accordingly. So thanks.
Hey y'all, my name is Anna. I'm a PhD student here. I just wanted to say first and foremost, y'all's papers are very dope. So thank you so much for doing them. This is kind of a question that applies to everyone, but it's an extension of something that was brought up earlier around sort of this pre-doc revolution. We see this sort of cap in GPAs. We think about sort of the politics that feed into how researchers ask questions, and then of course, sort of how that translates into the overall trend. How does the pre-doc kind of situation feed into all of that, right? So like, if you're thinking about economists or economic professors as sort of producers of economists, how does sort of this pre-doc situation kind of feed into the, I kind of will clear it up in the sense of, I think a lot of times the pre-doc to me seems more like a signal, an additional signal on top of, all the privilege that's been accounted for. And I can see that for some programs, it's more of like a training thing and trying to upskill, but it would be interesting to see how like professors, like what are their incentives to train students, and how does that kind of translate to these like better outcomes that you guys are trying to address? Thank you.
Can I just ask one quick question for the last talk? So before we congratulate ourselves that we are providing so much value, I'm just wondering what careers these people are pursuing and the degree to which it's just sorting. If you have any thoughts of that.
You want to go in
Sure.
reverse order?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we have like 2 minutes. We have
Okay.
5 minutes. We have 5
Good.
minutes. So,
Bullet points. Getting pulled into studying economics, about half of the return is switches across industries into industries like real estate, finance, accounting. The other half is within industry, though some of it is still across occupation. Right, there are 1.9 million economists. If you look at what share of them work in finance, the answer is something like 10 or 15%. Lots and lots of economists are making lots of money outside of finance. I think, to this question of the sort of efficiency ramifications of restrictions, I think it's worth keeping in mind that C students are learning a lot in economics classes, and there's little reason to believe that educating A students as opposed to C students is providing greater educational returns to those kids. And then finally, I think it's worth emphasizing that from the perspective of economic mobility, first, sorting is mobility enhancing for low-income students to the degree that the economics degree is sorted toward low-income students. And second, while pushing students toward studying economics at the undergraduate level, especially low-income students, is mobility enhancing, pushing low-income students toward the economics PhD is probably mobility disenhancing because they would have higher returns elsewhere.
Okay, so again, I won't respond to everything. I will say on the pedagogy and SES and partisanship, I will say one of the things that pushed me into working on the core economics textbook project was when I first started teaching. The immediate question I got after week 3 was like, "Are you a Republican?" And I was like, and so I was like, there's clearly something baked into the kind of standard thing that you're teaching that makes a normal person think that you're a Republican when you teach it. And so there's clearly something kind of correlated between in sort of the intro pedagogy that's associated with the partisanship. I have lots of thoughts about the pre-doc thing, but they're not rooted in any research, so I'll stay. I won't talk about them. On David's point about truth and finding evidence and the contradictory nature of it, I think that's. But I think I agree. We should be trying to build the best evidence base possible. But I think there's tons of policy and political issues that are not reducible to evidence, and that and that the evidence is contingent and is moving, and you might have to make decisions that don't necessarily come purely out of what the evidence base says. You have to make judgment calls about institutions, external validity, et cetera. And that's a place where a lot of like your pre-existing conceptions about how the world works and what's the good thing in the world will kind of have to enter in those implicit judgment calls. And so we might want to think about where those things come from.
Okay, I have 3 sets of thoughts that kind of pull on several of the themes here. On the point that Ansi phrased about within field composition, we know that correlated with the political stuff, but maybe not always causally so, we know that gender and race and ethnicity are particularly, women and underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities are particularly underrepresented in some of the fields like macro, finance, and econometrics. We don't know anything about SES on that. I don't know of any way to get data on that yet, but we're trying. I think it would be interesting to see if there's a correlation there and how that relates to the politics. In terms of kind of structure of the profession and who does it and what we do, I want to group kind of responses into 2 buckets. One is there are some basically free lunches that I think we as a discipline have been super slow to implement. One of them gets to this point about what economics is. There's been randomized control trial at Swarthmore by Amanda Bayer and Sion Benoit and other authors, where they literally just sent some information, I think even by email, to incoming fresh people. Sorry, first years. trying to be gender sensitive here about what the economics major is, who does economics, what kinds of topics they study, making it clear that it's very diverse, it's very broad. I mean, somewhat diverse at least, and broad. And they saw big increases in enrollment in the econ intro courses, particularly so from underrepresented minorities, low SES students, and women. So like very easy free lunch there that anyone can implement now. To Kelsey's point, examples and role models, we have very good evidence that bringing in a guest lecturer who is not a white privileged man in your course has an impact on people's persistence in econ. And the more you can do that and the more you can use examples like that, the better. We also have a lot of evidence from economics and from lots of other fields that a transparent process around access to opportunities, access to resources, again, going to Kelsey's point about how to persist in econ, whether to cold email professors, like the more we systematize and make transparent access to opportunities, the more it benefits everyone. If you're offering an RA-ship as a professor, advertise, publicize, don't just respond to the RA that emails you. All these kinds of things can be done and can be done easily and benefit everyone, but disproportionately people who don't have otherwise access to those information networks. It's not coincidental, I think, that we've seen the STEM fields pull away from econ in the last roughly 20 to 30 years, because that is about the time when STEM really started to invest lots of resources in doing this kind of stuff. Like a lot of the stuff they've done is more systematic, but a lot of the stuff they've done is this quite easy free lunch stuff that most of us in most econ programs aren't really doing. The second part I think is harder, which is the structural shift or equilibrium shift part. I think that's probably important. And that goes to the content. So I think the core econ is a very good illustration of one of the types of ways of teaching intro econ, which doesn't convey that we actually all think markets are efficient and market failures are sort of random, unusual aberrations, which is not what most economics thinks, but is the way we sort of tend to start our intro econ course. I think it also goes to Marta's point about behavior and signaling and actually publicly espousing some of the values that we want to be prevalent in the discipline. And many people do this very well, but I think more of us can do that. I think it also goes to Anna's point about pre-docs, and I will speculate on this because I worry that if we wait until we have evidence, it will just make things a lot worse, because my prior is that the way that the pre-doc system is working right now is mostly to narrow rather than widen the pipeline, because it is mostly selecting on people that are already doing incredibly well in terms of research, coding skills, math skills, and therefore is channeling people, instead of going straight to a top PhD, to go to a top pre-doc and then to a top PhD. And there are examples of pre-doc programs which are not doing that, but it's not the majority. And there was a survey about 3 years ago of pre-docs that found that they were probably more socioeconomically advantaged on average than your typical econ PhD. So I worry that if we wait for evidence on that without taking action, we'll make the problem worse. Yeah, that's all. Thank you, everyone.